Okay, we're going to resume our presentations for the 2020 Political Science Honors program. We are going to turn now to Greer Brigham's thesis, and his two readers are Ben Armstrong and Professor Dan D'Amico. So Professor Armstrong will do the honors of introducing Greer's thesis. I believe I'm going to unmute, and you are unmuted, Professor Armstrong.
Great. Thanks so much, Wendy. I had the great pleasure of meeting Greer when he came to me with this confusion, and he was confused about, I think, what many of us have been puzzled about recently, which is why do some people in the United States think the way they do about politics? And it was a confusion because I think Greer noticed this other world out there where people seem to have these beliefs that didn't align with the interests we might expect them to have. And he went out and tried to resolve his confusion. He went out and tried to figure it out. So what was so exciting about talking to Greer in the first place was that he, rather than just picking up books, which of course he did, he also hit the road. He went to work in factories and talk to farmers, and he went to solve the puzzle that was in his head when he came back to Brown. I really had the honor of trying to work through some of these ideas with him. And I know he consulted many faculty as he tried to understand what the process of work really did to our political beliefs, and specifically how our work makes us think about the role of government and the role of government taxation. And what I really loved about working with Greer, and it's kind of the best experience for a teacher, is that each time we had a conversation, he left and essentially he hit the road again. He went, he gathered new data and read more, and he came back with a bundle of new charts, maybe a new chapter. And I was always surprised because the option, maybe the more typical option, is to say, okay, I could go in this direction, but it's so much more work that I'm actually just gonna wall that off. It's a bigger project. But I don't think Greer at any point during this project said this is too big. Instead, he started with what would have been a very good thesis on its own, kind of the first three chapters, and he expanded it further and added an experiment to his thesis. So what I really appreciated about Greer's work ethic and his curiosity was that he just wanted to resolve this confusion that I think motivated the thesis in the first place. And I think that's the best we could hope for research, is to try to keep chasing after the puzzles that we have about how the world works. So Greer, thank you so much for bringing me along on this thesis, and I'm really excited for you to present the finding.
Thank you, and we'll return to Professor Armstrong and Professor D'Amico in the Q&A. Greer, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, and thank you, Professor Armstrong. That's very kind. So my thesis is Burns, Bruises, and Tax Cuts, and I'm basically looking at the relationship between having a difficult, painful, effortful job and the belief that your taxes are too high. And I've studied this issue for a year now with the thesis, but I've thought about it for a lot longer. So I'm going to go fast. If anyone has questions, please talk to me afterwards. Go next slide, please. So for me, all of this started in 2016 when Donald Trump won the presidency. I was shocked by that. And I realized that I needed to get out of the classroom and try to see things for myself and understand what happened. And so I did a bunch of trips to red states. I got some jobs on farms and in a factory in rural Wisconsin. And one of the things that I noticed in these travels were that a lot of the people that I met along the way were working these really tough, painful jobs. You see in the news about the West Virginia miners, or in Mississippi, the cotton and soybean farmers. And I, in the factory when I was working in Oostburg, Wisconsin, it was a really tough job. I remember at the end of each week, at the end of the first week, I counted 28 burns, bruises, and cuts all over my body. The factory floor frequently went above 110 degrees, where you're working for 8 hours a day, breathing in plastic particles. And I remember just collapsing into my apartment at the end of the day. I also remember that when I got that paycheck, I really valued that money because I knew what went into it, the sweat and blood that went into it. And so when when it came to pay taxes, that really hurt, and more so for any other job I worked. And so I thought, maybe there's a relationship here between the tough jobs I've been seeing on the road And also these anti-tax views. You know, I'd hear anti-tax, anti-government, anti-welfare views. Maybe there's a relationship here. Next slide, please. And so I went to the political science literature, and there's 6 main ways that political scientists think that we form our views on taxation. The first is self-interest theory. Basically, people form their opinions on a tax issue such that they'll be able to maximize their own income after tax day. And we see this a lot in academia. We see this a lot in the press. After the 2016 election, here were some headlines I found. A shock of people voting against their economic perceived self-interest. The counter to this theory is ignorance theory, which says that people don't really think about political issues that much. They definitely don't think about tax policy. And so they really form their views either at random or through some party trickery, where the party will focus their attention on social issues like abortion or gay marriage and slide in the economic policies that might be against their self-interest. There are other theories that we have up here, but something that I noticed throughout all of them is there's no talk about how people are actually earning the income being taxed, which seems like a massive gap for me. But it's not according to economic theory that's been around for a very long time that says that a dollar is a dollar. Doesn't matter how you earn it, you should value it the same. But I found that there's some research in psychology and behavioral economics that casts some doubt on that. Next slide, please. So as an example in psychology, there's a thing called the IKEA effect, which basically says that the more pain or effort you put into building an object, the more you're going to value that object. It's the whole business model for IKEA. That's why they make you build the dresser, the couch, and they don't pay someone to do that, because your effort and pain becomes one with that object, and you start valuing it more. Could we go back to that slide? The next one. Thank you. So that's one side, but while this has been verified for a number of different areas, this theory hasn't been tested for wages. And I think that's a gap, because I felt in the factory that I value the wages more due to the pain or effort that I put in to earn them. And another way to think about this is, if you look on the right here, if you had 2 people, person A and person B, person A has a really tough job. The only benefit they get from work are wages. Person B has a more pleasant job. They value their wages, but they also value the friendships at work or the prestige of the job. Well, it comes to tax day, the government can't tax prestige or friendship. It can only tax income. And so if there was a hypothetical 50% income tax, person A would lose half the benefits they get from work, while person B would only lose a quarter. So in either of these theories, I think there's a theoretical justification for what I felt, that maybe it is true that people with worse jobs tend to believe that taxes are too high. Next slide, please. So I wanted to test this, and I looked at, I used the Occupation Information Network, a database that it rates different occupations by their characteristics. How cramped is this job? How much do you have to deal with unpleasant people? I pulled the characteristics that I thought were related to occupational disutility, or the My Job is Terrible index. And I focused on the characteristics that involved risk. Are you going to die at work or get injured? Physically undesirable. Does your body hurt at the end of the day? Or mentally undesirable? Do you feel like there's a purpose to your work, or is it more repetitive? I took all that together and created this index that had a single number for every job that approximated how painful and tough and effortful is that job. Next slide, please. And I saw if there was a relationship between these painful jobs and believing the taxes were too high. And I found that if you look at the graph in the bottom left, even holding income, demographic information, political party constant, if someone had a worse, more painful, or effortful job, they tended to believe that their taxes were too high. More pleasant job, they tend to believe the taxes were about right. Would suggest that there is basis for my theory, but I wanted to take it a step further. While this shows a relationship, I wanted to show or test for whether these terrible jobs drive these anti-tax views. So I ran an experiment. If you go to the next slide, please. Basically, I had 300 people, and I sorted them into different groups. I'd like to give them actual jobs, but that's both impractical and unethical. So I had them have a hypothetical situation where I told one group, imagine that you're a travel agent. Travel agents earn about $40,000 a year, and my index says that they're pretty pleasant jobs. Another group, I said, imagine you're a metal furnace tender. My index says that's one of the worst jobs. They also make the same amount, $40,000 a year. And both pay about the same in federal income taxes. So self-interest theory says it doesn't matter what job you have, you should come up with the same views on taxation. But that's not what I found when I asked people, is this tax rate too high, about right, or too low? Next slide, please. I found that those who were working as travel agents, the low-paying jobs, they found that their taxes were about right, while the metal furnace tenders disproportionately thought that their taxes were too high. Again, this goes against self-interest theory and shows that there is some evidence for that feeling I had at the factory and saw across the country. Next slide, please. And so there are a number of implications for this. For political science, remember that list of 6 main ways we think about how people form their views? We need to think about how people are earning the taxable income. Clearly, it has an impact. It can help us better understand the electorate. For tax policy, this suggests that we should focus taxes on those more pleasant income streams like capital gains and provide tax cuts for those jobs that are more painful. For political messaging, if you want to argue for a tax cut, my data suggests you should show that Americans, the Americans you want the cut for, are suffering more than the average American at work, like Bob Dole does here. He shows the hard cat, i.e. risk, and work gloves, i.e. effort. If you're arguing for a tax hike, like Elizabeth Warren does for billionaires, show that they aren't suffering the same amount that we are. Clearly, it has effect on our views. And finally, for the future, this suggests that down the line, there's data that jobs in the future can become less risky and less physically strenuous. This suggests that in the future, people may be more amenable to taxation and more fiscally liberal, which could be a boon for Democrats. Next slide, please. But if I could zoom out a little bit and do some main takeaways, it's that from this research, $1 is not $1 for everybody. It matters how people earn it and the totality of these lives that are behind just these statistics at the broad level. And as we come into a time when many things are changing wages, automation, globalization, decline of unions, and low-skill immigration, to name a few beyond just taxation, we have to think about who's going to be hardest hit, who's going to feel the most pain, and who's going to react. And to this extent, we need to consider how people are earning their money. And I am so grateful for everyone that I met along these travels and this work for bringing me into their lives and allowing me to expand my own worldview. And taxes is one issue, but it's really changed in a whole number of areas. And I'm grateful to everyone I've met along the way. And the next slide, please. Bringing it back to Brown, I'd especially like to thank Professor Ben Armstrong and Daniel D'Amico, who have helped throughout this whole process, argued, debated with me over these ideas, and helped a great amount in the writing of this thesis. Professor Wendy Schiller for organizing this class. And all the faculty, family, and friends have supported me along the way and listened to me rattle off about tax policy for over a year now. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Greer. That was an excellent presentation. We're going to go to Professor Dan D'Amico, who I think I have unmuted. I'm going to unmute Professor Dan D'Amico first for a question, and then Professor Ben Armstrong second for a question. Okay, Professor D'Amico.
I want to start just by echoing everything that Professor Armstrong said about how impressed I've been with Greer's sort of evolution in this project over the course of the year. Same as Professor Armstrong, it's been really fun to see you sort of ping pong ideas off of us and then go back into the field and gather more data and frame the project. I guess my general question is really broad insofar as the question of generalizability of this relationship that you're uncovering. So trying to think through it a little bit, the framework that you included in your presentation about addressing questions of voting against one's self-interest is an obvious application. Other applications that come to mind would be explaining the rural and urban divide that seems to be very significant and or growing in the United States. And then thirdly, it relates very closely to an honors thesis presentation that I was a reader for last year, Natalie Ullman. She was interested in generational cohort effects. The idea that college-age students, millennials, Gen Z, tend to have systematically different political attitudes than population writ large. And thinking about your observation, the work experience levels of generational cohorts clearly differ, right? Someone graduating college who's never necessarily had a full-time employment or office experience may shape their political attitudes towards taxation in very different ways than someone who's been in the wage force for 10, 20, 30 years. And so I guess one question would be, do you see these as opportunities for a generalized application of your theory? And then secondly, how significant, if you had to sort of just give rough estimates, a little, a lot, how would you sort of sign the coefficient of your effect relative to potentially other explanations in those arenas?
Yeah, all very interesting questions. For the first one, like groups, like rural Americans, I looked at whether this index showed that those people had tougher jobs according to my index, and I found that these rural voters definitely have harder jobs, and that could be related to these conservative tax views we see. I find the same for minorities, that minorities tend to have tougher jobs and also hold more anti-tax views than white people, which is also interesting. Same for educational background. People without a college degree tend to have more tough jobs and also tend to believe that their taxes are too high more than college educated people. So I think there's definitely application for those more minute analyses. For the generational, it's interesting. I don't have as much data on that. I think it will be interesting to see as people shift jobs more quickly. When I was working in the factory, I met guys who had been there since they graduated from high school and who were in their 60s. That's not going to be the true for my generation. And are these effects going to really sink in as much as they have for the past? I don't know. And how will that look like as the whole job market changes? That should be super interesting. In the process of this, your last question was the magnitude. And I think that when we were looking at those first slides and we saw that there was, in the national data, 13 percentage point difference. So from the people who have the most pleasant job to the least pleasant job, even controlling for all this background information, shows that this is a big characteristic. And that's especially given, how I did this. These are very rough estimates on my end. I can't get down to see how tough a certain person's job is. This is very broad. So if our data gets more granular, we could find even larger effects. So it's an important thing to keep into account.
Thanks, Greer. Great job.
Thank you.
Thanks. Professor Armstrong, do you want to ask a question? Let's see. There we go. Unmute. All right.
Yeah, thanks so much, Greer. I thought you presented the findings really well. Two quick questions. One is about the mechanism. So you had this really nice chart that said essentially the benefits of a high utility job. There are a lot of non-monetary benefits and the benefits that can't be taxed. And I wonder partly linking back to your Trump voter puzzle at the beginning, how much of it is about kind of prestige and resentment? Because there's this argument from Wisconsin, Kathy Kramer-Walsh, that essentially says rural voters in Wisconsin who voted for Trump were motivated by resentment of Madison and resentment of people with these really nice jobs where they have kind of cushy offices and can kind of chat around the water cooler versus folks who do real work, right? That's kind of the perception. And I wonder, again, to Professor D'Amico's point, would political resentment or feelings about the other, is this one of the divides we should think about when we think about polarization? Divides between people who have nice jobs and people who have crappy jobs. So that's the first piece. And the second piece, I'm wondering if you've thought about this growing literature about automation and the policy discussions, right? What we should do about automation. Andrew Yang made this a centerpiece of his campaign. Irrespective of whether you think his solution is correct, there's a growing concern about how automation is going to change the nature of work, perhaps the dignity of work. And how I read your conclusion is that the folks who might be most subject to automation don't have a lot of dignity in their work in the first place, or maybe dignity is the wrong word, or their jobs are bad. So I'm wondering how your findings help us think about the consequences of automation or the potential consequence of automation and how government should deal with it.
Yeah, both interesting questions. For the resentment one, I do think that's interesting. You think about, Fox News and Donald Trump talking about real Americans. And I think it's trying to echo this resentment that some people feel as the country changes. And there's this divide that we see. In future jobs, research suggests that they're really going to bifurcate, where you've got these high skill, high tech jobs, and then those really manual jobs that are can't be automated will still exist, and the country could continue to diverge. And so resentment could play a strong role. I don't have data for that, but it's interesting. And then for automation, I think that could be interesting in a couple different ways. for one, I think it could hurt some of the people who are suffering or that have these tough jobs. I think wages could decline, which could lead them to feel pain, which would lead to some of these anti-tax views. But at the same time, automation is also, it's also eliminating these jobs and providing better jobs that could lead people to hold these to less anti-tax views, feel less pain. So it really could work it could hurt some people and then create new opportunities in other areas that will leave us with a very complex political scene to come.
I think that's a great way to end the presentation and end the Q&A. You did a fantastic job. And thanks to you and thanks to your readers, Ben and Dan. I know you're also entertaining several different paths forward in different arenas. And we, as with all of you, we think you're going to do really wonderful things. And we think you're going to take these ideas and implement them somehow in our political spectrum.